You've all heard it. Black is the new green. We're talking today about biochar, and a big topic these days in the arenas that we tread in. And like many of you, I'm sure I have gone back and forth about this magical substance in terms of how it's produced, how it gets used, what is the best application of it. So we're speaking to an expert that I particularly sought out. In one of her writings, she cites Justus von Liebig, the father of organic chemistry, who wrote that charcoal surpasses all other substances in the power which it possesses of condensing ammonia within its pores. It absorbs 9 times its volume of ammoniacal gas, which may again be separated by simply moistening it with water. And that led to a bunch of experimenting with charcoal for agriculture and waste management that lasted for nearly a century. Well, the person who was writing about our friend Eustace is Kelpie Wilson, my guest today, who also wrote and just released the Biochar Handbook. Kelpie is founder of Wilson Biochar Associates and a mechanical engineer, writer, and consultant with a background in renewable energy and forest protection. Currently, she specializes in biochar technology and market development. Commissioned by a broad portfolio of clients, Ms. Wilson has been a reliable voice for climate change, energy, and the environment, and has authored white papers, research summaries, reports, cost study papers, grant proposals, and hundreds of articles. Her clients include the International Biochar Initiative, Cool Planet Energy Systems, Oregon Biochar Solutions, Frye Poultry, Pembroke Family Farmers. This is a very long list. It goes on and on and on. As communications editor and project development director for the International Biochar Initiative between 2008 and 2012, Kelpie managed the public process and document development to publish the first international standards for product definition and testing. One of the reasons I sought her out is not just because of that extensive biography, but because I feel like in the noise around biochar, Kelpie has a very rational voice about where and how and when it makes sense. And as a commercial product specifically, why we need to care about those things. So without further delay, let's get into my conversation with Kelpie after a brief word from Jesse and our sponsors.
Today's episode is brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. Today's episode is also brought to you by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are designed and built in Italy, where small-scale farming has been a way of life for generations. Discover the beauty of BCS on your farm with PTO-driven implements for soil working, shredding cover crops, spreading compost, mowing under fences, clearing snow, and much more, all powered by a single gear-driven machine that's tailored to the size and scale of your operation. We have been using a BCS tractor on our farm since 2014, and it has saved the day and leveled the workload more times than I can count. And I find new ways to employ it every single season. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. All right, enjoy the show.
Kelpie, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me today. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Congratulations on your book.
Hey, thank you so much. Yeah. And thanks for inviting me, and looking forward to this. And yeah, the book has been very exciting.
Well, I think it's kind of a long journey that you've taken to arrive both at biochar and at a book on biochar. And I would love to just share with everyone your very interesting history and sort of how many different, kind of I guess avenues of being involved in the sort of environmental movement, but also just this sort of, soils and ecology. It's a really interesting background. And so if you wouldn't mind giving us sort of the long version of your story and how you've arrived at biochar, that would be great.
Okay, but be prepared. It's long because I just turned 68 yesterday. So
happy birthday.
There's a lot of history there. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it feels great. It feels great to be this age and to have done so many interesting things. I'm really grateful to have had the opportunities I've had and the great teachers I've had along the way as well. And I guess to start with, I would just start with my mother, who's 95, still with us. And she grew up on a farm in Indiana. And her people were there, farm people for several generations. And that's what got them through the Great Depression is they had food because they lived on a farm. And not everybody had access to food during those years in the 1930s. And of course, she left the farm and, became a very sophisticated city woman, and never really wanted to go back. But her stories about being on the farm and, feeding the chickens, churning butter. Boy, they didn't even have electricity. They didn't even have running water. They got their water from a well pump. And it was a big, exciting time when they got their first radio that they hooked up to a car battery. So this is my mother, this is one generation away. And so we forget sometimes how radically things have changed in our lifetimes, in our parents' lifetimes, or our grandparents' lifetimes. But I remember hearing those stories. And then as a child, I always just loved being outdoors, being in the woods. And I didn't want to live in the city. I wanted to be living in the country or in the woods. And when I went to college, I started out wanting to be a biologist, and I wanted to be an environmental lawyer to protect the environment. So this was just after Earth Day 1970, when the environment became a big issue, and it really spoke to me. And so I didn't end up becoming a lawyer or a biologist because at the same time, I was also becoming aware of the energy crisis. And, so here it is, the early 70s. Most of you who are listening to this probably weren't even alive then, but we had something called the OPEC oil embargo. And there were actually gas lines in this country where you had to wait in line for your turn to buy gas because there were shortages. And that made a big impression on me. I was just about to get my driver's license, and I'm thinking, well, gosh, am I even going to be able to drive? So I ended up switching my focus in college to engineering because I thought I'd like to be part of the solution to find a better, find a solution to the energy crisis, because everything we have in our civilization is dependent on these fossil fuels. And I got my degree in mechanical engineering. And this was right in, it took me a few years to get through college. I was doing a lot of different things, but this was right in the early 80s when Ronald Reagan was now our president. And, during the Carter years, there was some emphasis on renewable energy and trying to find some solutions. And, Carter had put solar panels up on the White House. Ronald Reagan took them down. So there was really no progress in the alternative energy field. In fact, everybody was drill, baby, drill, and let's go get the Alaska oil, and very short-sighted. Let's do our economic development now. Let's have growth now. Let's not think about the future. And I just found that just atrocious. So that's why I wanted to do something about renewable energy. But when I got my degree, finally, there was nothing happening because all the programs that Carter had were defunded under Reagan. And so I didn't know what to do with myself. Well, I'd gone to college at CSU Chico, and which is, a beautiful area there in the Sierra foothills. And I'd been spending a lot of time in the mountains and hiking around Lassen National Park and, and falling in love with the forests and the trees. And that's when I learned about clear cutting. They're cutting the forest down. They're cutting the ancient forests, the big old trees. And that's not right. Well, I'm not going to have my career in renewable energy, I guess, because there's no funding to do any research or any development. So, gosh, there's this group called Earth First, and they're going out and they're saving trees. They're chaining themselves to trees and logging equipment and all that stuff. And I thought, what else am I going to do? I love these forests. And here's this group of people that are doing these actions. They're actually doing something. So I joined up and went right after I graduated, got my degree. I went up to Oregon, right here where I am now in Southern Oregon. And there was a group of people that was getting ready to protest a timber sale. So there was a group of people getting ready to protest a timber sale in the North Kalmiopsis roadless area on the Siskiyou National Forest. I joined up with them. I had no idea what I was doing. We went out at 3 a.m. to this very remote place in the forest where a logging show was set up. And we trained ourselves to a logging yarder. And one of my friends who was with our group actually went out on the guy wire that was holding that yarder pole to the hillside, hand over hand, with a climbing rig. She went all the way out top of the pole and hung a banner. So it was a very dramatic action. And then the loggers showed up about 6 a.m. And here we were chained to their logging yarder, and they couldn't work for the day. And they were mad. They threw some rocks at us, but basically they called the police, and the police came after a couple hours because it was very remote. So we're just hanging out on this yarder. And the police came and they cut our bike locks we had around our necks and took us to jail. And, but we made the news. So that's why we did those things. And it ultimately ended up having an effect. Over the next 10 years then, I ended up working for an environmental group called the Siskiyou Regional Education Project. And we did every kind of advocacy, beyond the direct action. We were moving more in towards public education, letting people know what was happening, talking about the values of biodiversity and old growth forests and ecosystem services. So it was a way for me to get back into my science head. So I started learning about biodiversity. I started learning about biology again, and ecosystems and ecological functions. And then we carried that education out to the public, and more of the public said, "This is silly. These are public lands. We own these forests, and we shouldn't be liquidating them for short-term profit, because some of these trees are hundreds of years old. These ecosystems are ancient, and once you disturb them, they don't come back the same way. At least not for another few thousand years." So that was actually successful. And by the end of the 1990s, we had a roadless area rule. We had kind of changed the culture of the Forest Service. So it moved from being primarily an agency that was really captured by the timber industry to an agency that placed more emphasis on protecting the ecological values. And we saw more ologists, we called them, biologists, ecologists. And with the roadless area rule now, kind of entering new roadless areas was off the table. And then there was also the Northwest Forest Plan, et cetera, et cetera. So we really were pretty successful. So in the early 2000s, that was a lot of work. It was, for me personally, it was just a lot of work. I was running the organization and involved in all these campaigns, and I was a little burned out. And so I started becoming a writer, writing about all kinds of ecological issues, biodiversity, climate change, all energy. So I was writing for a number of different news outlets and magazines. And that's when I heard about Terra Preta. And this was part of the really the peak oil movement. I don't know if people remember around 2005, there was a lot of talk about, are we reaching actually the peak of conventional oil production? A lot of analysts were saying, yeah, we're here. And it's actually turned out that way, that pretty much reached the peak of conventional oil production. And that's when we moved over to fracking and these other extraction technologies, more offshore oil. So basically what's happening is oil is getting more expensive to produce. We're still producing oil, but it's getting more expensive. It's a big reason why we're having the economic problems we're having today. But at any rate, that peak oil community of people that suddenly became very active online with information around that time frame also was exploring a whole lot of other very interesting things. And that's where I first heard about Terra Preta, these soils in the Amazon that could regenerate themselves, seemingly. And there was an area the size of France that could grow crops in the rainforest. So there was this area in the Amazon, supposedly the size of France, that had rich black soil that could grow crops. And I knew from my previous forest activism that one of the first campaigns I got involved in was Burger King. And it was a boycott of Burger King because they were using rainforest beef. They're cutting down the forests in the Amazon to grow cattle, to graze cattle. And we're producing all this very cheap beef, and it was being imported in the US and by Burger King and other, fast food outlets. And so it was cheap hamburger that was destroying rainforests. And that was one of the first forestry campaigns I got involved in. So I knew that when you cut down the rainforest, the soil washes away because the trees are what's holding it together. And the soils are actually very poor in that rainforest. They're red, they're highly leached. There's not much carbon in the soil. All the carbon is in the living vegetation. So when you cut that down, you've completely changed that environment. So when I heard about Terra Preta black soils in the Amazon, I knew this can't be natural, because we know what happens when you cut down trees, when you cut down the rainforest. It doesn't grow back. The soils are really, really poor. And then I saw these pictures of the black Terra Preta soils compared to the native highly leached red soils, and a corn crop growing on top of it. And the black soils are producing a beautiful corn crop, and the highly leached red native oxasols were producing something very stunted, nothing you could really do agriculture on. So that was just fascinating to me. And it was hopeful, with all the other bad news about the environment, this was something very hopeful, that we could actually restore soils and restore ecosystems. So that really got me going. And I thought, I want to write more about this. This is so interesting. So I started looking for more stories about Terra Preta, and there weren't many. But I did hear about a conference that was happening in Australia in 2007. And it was the very first biochar conference before they even called it biochar. They were calling it agrichar then. And I convinced an editor of mine at a yoga magazine I was writing for to send me there to cover the conference. So I got a trip to Australia, and I wrote an article about the conference. And there were about 100 people there, mostly soil scientists, but also a fair number of people involved in climate action. And there was a group called, I can't remember what they were called initially, but they became the International Biochar Initiative. That was a conf where group there, let's call it biochar, and not agrichar. Let's call it biochar. So after that, I went back home and thought, I really want to work in this field. So I contacted the IBI people, and I said, can I come work for you? And they said yes. So they hired me to help with communications. And so I worked for IBI for 4 years. And the thing that I did at the very end of my time there that was most interesting was I got to be the person who organized and facilitated the stakeholder process for coming up with the first standards. So testing standards for biochar. So yeah, that's how I got involved in biochar.
Such a cool story, and following just your curiosity and kind of love of the natural world. It's an obvious path when you think about it that way, but not obvious at all if you just looked at it on a map. I'd love for you to just explain what biochar is, and if you could go a little bit into what we know about terra preta and how we've learned about both the process and the history of this substance and how it was produced and how it is produced now and how you came to the standards that you developed. But start with, what is biochar?
What is biochar? Well, biochar is just charcoal. But the thing you need to know is that charcoal isn't just one thing. Char isn't just one thing. It's carbon, number one. And it's carbon in a particular form that we would call aromatic carbon. So if you look at carbon, it's really a shape shifter. If you look at carbon in a diamond, for instance, it's got a kind of triangular pattern where the carbon atoms link up to make a carbon molecule in a diamond. And that's very different from carbon that's in charcoal. That's a hexagonal pattern. And that is also very common in all kinds of organic compounds in nature. So there's just all sorts of carbon compounds that have that hexagonal ring structure that are part of our bodies, that are part of drugs, that are part of every kind of organic carbon compound in nature. And what happens when you make biochar charcoal from biomass is, take a piece of wood, for instance, and wood is composed of cellulose and lignin and some other stuff. So it's mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and some nitrogen. But if you look at the lignin molecule, for instance, it has this aromatic carbon backbone. And aromatic just means that six-sided ring. And it's got this backbone. And when you apply heat to the wood, that backbone of carbon has other things attached to it: hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And those, with heat, will volatilize. They'll become a gas and they'll leave. And then the carbon rings, though, are much more stable. They don't gasify that easily. So those remaining carbon molecules will then link up together and make this sheet of hexagonal rings. It's kind of like, think of a beehive. That's what it looks like. All those hexagons connected together. And those bonds between the carbon atoms are very, very strong. They're hard to break once they're formed. So by heating the wood, the volatile stuff leaves, the carbon links up and becomes very strong. Not as strong as a diamond, but still very strong. Strong enough that biology, that microbes have trouble breaking it apart. So that's the first thing to really know about biochar, is it's very stable carbon. And, it was one of the first things that intrigued me about biochar is, oh goodness, this is a climate solution, because the trees grow and pull carbon dioxide, form their tissues, making the lignin and the cellulose. And then, in the normal course of events, in the normal carbon cycle, that tree might, eventually dies and falls to the ground, and things start chewing away at it. And as those microbes eat the wood, they emit gases. They emit CO2 as part of their respiration. So it goes back to the atmosphere, and that's the natural carbon cycle. Well, biochar is an intervention in that. So now we can take the carbon that the tree removed from the atmosphere and we can keep it out of the atmosphere and we can put it in soil. So that's what into the carbon cycle. Right. So, but that's number one. And that's why at that first, biochar conference that I went to, there were a lot of climate people there because they could see that potential. And that's really kind of what got everybody so excited about biochar to begin with. But as I've gotten further into it, what it does for soil is just astounding. So
we're definitely going to talk about that. So the sort of history of biochar and what we know about terra preta, was this part of agricultural production? Was it some other practice? I mean, can you talk a little bit about the origins of biochar and how we, kind of figured that out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the first soil scientists were looking at the terra preta soils starting in maybe the 90s, towards the end of the last century, and wondering where it came from. Was this natural? Where did all these black soils came from? And what they eventually came to was looking at the pattern of distribution of these soils. So I said, it's an area the size of France. Well, it's not one contiguous area. Where these terra preta sites are located is along the high river bluffs in the Amazon. So these were the areas where people would congregate during the rainy season. So in the dry season in the Amazon, people could spread out more and hunt and fish and forage from the environment. But during the rainy season, the high bluffs were where people could really, settle and not worry too much about, they kind of had to congregate on the high bluffs. And I think the first Spanish explorers who went down the Amazon noted that there were huge numbers of people. There were more people living in the Amazon then, before Columbus or, before Europeans came, than there are now. So it was a pretty well populated area. And there were like linear cities along the rivers, kind of like we have cities along our highways, right? Because that was the transportation corridor. And so people are living semi-permanently on these high river bluffs, and they're doing agriculture. And they're concentrated. So there's a small area along these rivers, and they're kind of concentrated. So they have to deal with their waste. So I think that's the second thing about biochar. After the carbon, it's the waste management. And it was probably a product of their waste management that produced these soils. Perhaps, inadvertently at first, but over time, perhaps they were doing it deliberately. We don't really know. But, think of people concentrated in an area. They're eating a lot of fish. They're eating whatever they forage, and they have to deal with their waste. And they had a lot of terracotta pottery. So you find that also in these black soils. So the black soils were kind of spreading out from where the settlements are. And the further away you get, the less black they are, because people weren't carrying the material that far, but they might have started trying to carry it further just to build the soils. And sometimes those pots, where the night soil was, if you know what night soil is, it's just poop. And they, and people always used ash from cooking fires with bits of charcoal in it as a way to help deodorize this waste. And so it would end up out in the fields, sometimes with broken pottery. And eventually, probably people noticed, well, gosh, things grow better in that soil. It's a richer soil. And then, the cultivation of corn came probably from Central America. And that came to those people, and pretty soon they're growing crops. Now, the thing about the terra preta and the Amazon is that's not the only place where you see this. So that was really fascinating to me to learn that there are places in Africa. There are places actually all over Europe. If you look at medieval cities and the areas outside the city, some of the archaeological digs are finding some rich black soils there as well, because you have the same thing. You have a walled city. People are in there making their waste, having their cooking fires, mixing their ash with bits of char into the waste and taking it outside the city to where the farms are. And so you see the same thing all over the world. Asia, everywhere. It's most noticeable in the Amazon because the native soils are so poor. Well, there was also a revival or a biochar craze, you could call it, that happened in the 19th century in Europe. So you've got traditional agriculture and all the different ways people were growing food. And then starting around the early 19th century, science. You start getting modern science. You get chemists, you get physics, you get all these discoveries. And Justus Liebig, who we all know, we're into soil and we're into learning how to grow food. We know about Justus Liebig because he was the inventor of chemical agriculture. So the one who said, yes, you need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are the nutrients that you need to grow plants. And we've probably seen an illustration of Liebig's barrel where he talks about, it doesn't help to add twice as much nitrogen if the plant doesn't really need it, but if you don't have enough boron, your plants are going to suffer, right? So it's about sufficiency. Anyway, he was a good scientist, and he was trying to show that that these are the plant nutrients and it's chemistry. It's about chemistry. And he sort of poo-pooed the idea of humus and soil carbon. Didn't think it was important because people before him who'd investigated plant growth and soil fertility had said, it's the black soil that really grows plants. And that's because it has carbon in it. So that's where plants are getting their carbon. And Liebig said, I don't think so, because I took some pure charcoal and I just add a little chemical fertilizer to it and it grew plants. So the plants aren't getting their carbon from the soil, they're getting it from the atmosphere. And he was right. And now we're looking at our situation now where our soils are so depleted of carbon and we're having a lot of trouble growing plants and thinking, well, Justus Liebig didn't do us any favors, right? Because we're promoting organic agriculture and he promoted the chemical version of it. But what I found out was reading his books, actually, that he, during his life, very well understood the importance of soil carbon for holding nutrients in soil. And the power of humus, he did come to understand that. So, that just shows he was a good scientist, that he could change his mind eventually. And he became actually an advocate for sewage treatment, better sewage treatment, because there was a huge movement in the 19th century to deal with sewage in London and these big cities, in Paris, where again they had been using the night soil system, where you had the night soil man came with his cart and took your barrels of waste and buckets out to the edge of the city where it was processed into some kind of fertilizer that was sold to farmers. That was the system. And people didn't really like having to deal with that, understandably. And that's when the flush toilet was invented. But there wasn't really any sewage treatment. So there was a cholera epidemic in London, and there was a lot of controversy for years about it. And Liebig actually wrote a letter to the city of London saying, you need to go back to the old method, and there's better ways to do it. You could use charcoal to deodorize it and preserve the nutrients. Because what you're producing now, taking this stuff to the outskirts, it's losing all its nitrogen. So he wrote that letter to the city of London, but they didn't listen because everybody at this point was now hooked on the idea of just flush it and forget it. So that was one element that was happening in the 19th century. And then additionally, there was a lot of writing about charcoal in agricultural journals. People, were discovering it partly due to Liebig and other researchers and practitioners. And so there's actually quite a bit of literature from that period of time on the value of charcoal in agriculture.
I love in your book how you tell some of these stories, because I think that it is so interesting. Things could have gone a very different way. And also just in terms of the the real intrigue of this atom, this carbon atom, and how it really truly has these unique properties at, atomically, and then as a molecule, molecularly, the way that it can form different structures, and its stickiness and its capacity to do kind of heroic work for as simple as it is. So I think now it would be good to talk about the process of making biochar and why the process matters, and what that means for the outcome for the finished product.
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's two main ways of making charcoal traditionally. So the way of making charcoal that most people think of or are aware of is making charcoal for cooking. So that's fuel charcoal. And traditionally it was made by piling up wood in a pit, throwing dirt over it, lighting one end of it, and letting it slowly smolder for days. This was very polluting, very nasty. And after, days and days, it's a kind of a low temperature process where it slowly smolders and the gases leave as this thick smoke. But some of the hydrogen and oxygen, other elements will recondense as a tarry, oily material in the pores of the charcoal. And that makes that's good for fuel. That's good for burning. And, the reason to make charcoal rather than just burn wood is that you could make it in the forest and transport it out to a city or another user. And it burns a little more cleanly because it's already gotten rid of some of the smoke. That's not really great for soil. It's not terrible, but it would take a little more time to be conditioned to be able to use in soil. So the other basic way of making charcoal is in an open flame. And everybody does this. Whenever you have a campfire, you're making charcoal, but you're also burning it up. And the reason I say that is because making charcoal in an open flame is a two-stage process. The first stage is heating the wood, the gases leave, burn in a flame. And then what's left behind is you'll see it in a campfire, a glowing coal at the end of the night. The flames die down, but you're still getting some heat from that red glowing coal. Well, that's your charcoal. And if you want to make charcoal, save it, put it out with water. So it's that simple. Now, those are the low-tech ways. The industrial ways there are many, many different ways to make charcoal. One of the simplest and easiest to understand is something like a wood stove or a boiler. In my area, there's a power plant, a biomass power plant that produces 30 megawatts of electricity. It's been in operation for a couple of decades, and it uses ground up wood, some from local sawmills, some from green waste that the city collects. And it's just ground up in a big tub grinder, and then they just blow it into a furnace. It's called a boiler that boils water to make steam to drive a steam turbine and make electricity. Well, during that process of burning up that ground up wood, there's a lot of airflow. So the combustion can happen, and the airflow takes small particles of that wood that are only partly burned. They've just charred, but they haven't completely burned. And those go through a cyclone filter so they don't go in the atmosphere and fall out. And it's about 40% carbon. It's like a high carbon ash. The rest of it's mineral ash from the wood. And that material is now being screened. It used to just go to a landfill. It's being screened to remove the mineral ash. So you have these little tiny biochar flakes. It's wonderful biochar. It's really easy to use because it's already in a nice small size, so you can mix it with other material. So that's the most kind of simple, straightforward way to make biochar in an industrial process and also get the energy out of it. And that can be done at many different scales. You can do it at the scale of, a small facility that doesn't make electricity, that just provides heat for a building like a school or a hospital or even district heating. That's one way to do it, to get the energy. And yeah, that would be a good thing to do wherever we have excess biomass, is to be able to get the energy and the biochar out of it. So that's another way to do it. There are other ways too that involve either what we call a retort, where it's a vessel that holds biomass material. You heat it externally, and the gases come out of it, and you're left with. Then you don't have to worry so much about how to leave the charcoal, because it's protected from the air because it's in a vessel. And there are continuous versions of this where it's a rotating drum is one way to do it, where the material flows through. It's heated, the gases come off, and the char comes out at the end. So there's a lot of different ways to do this industrially. And normally you would design your industrial process to handle the particular feedstock you're dealing with, because that's always the biggest, most expensive part of the problem. It's, it's not rocket science doing this pyrolysis, is what we call it, to make charcoal. It's pretty old technology, but handling the biomass is the expensive, difficult part that takes a lot of engineering and thought.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud sponsor of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, tools, and information to help ensure their growing success and help feed their communities and families. The research farm is at the heart of Johnny's, where they trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Their breeding program uniquely focuses on introducing varieties that meet the needs or solve the challenges mixed market, small farmers, and avid gardeners face. Visit johnnyseeds.com for innovative new varieties and time-tested favorites to grow this season. You can also browse their online growers library, link in the description, for a wealth of free educational resources. The employee owners at Johnny's look forward to growing with you. Today's episode is also brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to grow food, not spend my time creating pack lists, writing newsletters, responding to emails, or maintaining web stores. If I could spend less time on my phone and computer and more time farming, that would be a win. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for CSA farmers. It takes care of the admin, managing orders, customer communications, and automating tedious tasks, so you can get back to doing what you love. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers 6 hours a week. That's 6 hours you could spend with your family, out in the field, or simply taking a breather. So, what would you do with an extra 6 hours? Now's the time to get your systems ready for next season. Learn how Farmhand can help at farmhand.partners/no-till. All right, back to the show.
Definitely. And that is great segue, because I want to get into some of the different feedstocks and why we should be thoughtful about biochar. It's very trendy to talk about biochar right now in especially sort of the regenerative agriculture movement. And I think a lot of people are really interested, but there are reasons to think about, what feedstocks are being used, how it's being produced, how far those feedstocks have to travel. So can you educate us a little bit about the different feedstocks and how that kind of influences the end product, and also how these systems might come together to be solving problems rather than maybe possibly even creating problems in terms of a continuous feedstock source?
That's a great question. Early on, of course, I had some questions about biochar, especially regarding forests and biomass. Biomass energy could be kind of a scary thing. It is kind of a scary thing when you think about scaling it up. For instance, there have been various proposals to take a lot of material out of the forest and turn it into wood pellets and ship it halfway around the world to operate a biomass power plant in Europe, supposedly for climate benefits. These things don't make sense. You need to do something called life cycle analysis, where you look at not just cradle to grave from the source, of the material to where it ends up, but cradle to cradle. So from the source all the way through in a circular process to where you can regenerate then again that resource. And with forests and wood, there is a certain amount that we can use for energy, but we need to be careful not to exceed that amount and actually the capacity and health of our forests. Right now in the Western US, we have another problem, which is the fire threat from decades of forest mismanagement. We have excess biomass that needs to be processed or needs to be removed from the forest somehow. And some of that can be used for energy production. What I'm mostly focused on right now, my work, is making biochar in the woods to leave in the woods. So this is a little bit of a different focus than doing it commercially. And it's all about returning good fire to the land. Here's one thing that people might not know is that charcoal's natural in soils. So in the forestry context, in some places in the West, half of the carbon in the soil is charcoal from past fires. And more, if you dig down into the soil horizon, the older layers have a lot more charcoal than the more recent ones because of the fire suppression. So returning good fire to the land means restoring that charcoal, which is really necessary for soil health in forests. But there's some steps to take before we can actually do that because of the very overcrowded nature of some of these forests right now. So there's a lot of money being spent on cutting and piling and burning or chipping material in the woods just to reduce the fire threat. And what we propose is to make biochar from that material so that you get an immediate carbon benefit. So that's a whole nother topic. In addition to that way of making char, though, biochar, we can also do this in ag lands. One of my projects where I learned so much about these techniques was a conservation innovation grant from the NRCS, National Service, where we got some funding to work with small farmers who had forest land and farmland. A good example is a grass-fed beef operation we worked with here in Oregon, where that farmer had a good amount of forest land that needed thinning work, and also had pasture that was somewhat acidic and really needed more carbon. And so there were a number of farmers like that we worked with, and that's when we first developed the Ring of Fire kiln that I sell for making biochar, and some other techniques. And what we did then was mix it with manure from the feeding operation, from the feed barn, the winter feeding barn, where we laid down the biochar and the cattle pooped on it and mixed it. And then we had this wonderful, wonderful biochar compost. So that's another way to make biochar, being mindful of where is the feedstock coming from. So that's woody feedstock. Now, there's a lot of other feedstocks out there. There's crop waste, and how do you deal with that? And that's a little more difficult to do in a low-tech way. So there's some, so for instance, though, what you want to look for is where is biomass accumulating naturally? Rather than trying to go out and gather it up, where is it actually happening naturally? So, and that's hard to say. In a food processing facility, say in California, where they're processing almonds and they have almond hulls and shells, that's a great place to set up a pyrolysis plant and make char because the stuff's already there. It's in a pretty easy form to process. You don't have to reduce the size of it. It's a nutshell. So there's equipment available that can run that through and turn it to biochar pretty easily.
That is so cool. I want to, I kind of want to go back to something really important. I think for those of us who do live in the West, I'm a winemaker, and, pretty much every farmer that I know or work with has some level of PTSD from the recent fires and the sort of devastation that can bring. And what I really feel people need to understand better is that the missing carbon from our forests has actually made fire more dangerous, and that returning that layer of carbon and the regular deposition of, a more regular fire return interval would make these fires safer. And so I think that part of the work that you're doing is super critical. And, there are any number of restoration projects in the West right now that I hope will start to pay attention to, that layer of what we can bring back. As, we look at different methodologies, whether it's when I worked in the Forest Service, one of the jobs that we would do when, something else wasn't going on was make piles of slash, and then they would be burned. And sometimes they were never burned, and sometimes they were, and it was not very efficient. And I think that we've left a lot of value on the table in terms of how we've approached forest management in the past. And I think that that's a really important thing for people to understand, because we've gotten to be so triggered, for lack of a better word, by fire in the West that we think that there's this sort of binary approach to it, where we could be looking at, sort of the ecological 50,000 foot view and thinking about how would we make fire safer, because it hasn't always been like this.
Yeah, well, we have a lot to learn from the first best stewards of the land here. The native people understood and did a great job and actually created the landscapes that the Europeans found when they got here. I'm not really sure what it would have looked like without their burning, but they created really these beautiful open park-like forests in many places, and kept a lot of areas much safer from fire by doing regular burning. So that's what we need to go back to, and that knowledge is still there. There are people and traditions who've kept doing this burning tradition throughout, even when it was not really legal. They'd still do their burning. And part of that was because for cultural reasons, to regenerate some of the plants that they used for making basketry materials and foods and so forth. So that's where we need to go back. And there's a step in between. And so I've looked at a lot of different ways to do that, to make biochar in the woods. And because you just can't haul all that material out. You really can't. It's too remote. It's too steep. It's just too difficult to get to. The kilns that we've developed work really, really well. But more and more, I'm really just looking at different ways of doing pile burning, because that's the cheapest way to treat the material, is pile it and burn it. And people are, like you said, traumatized by smoke. And so the idea of even pile burning is hard for a lot of people to want to do, much less landscape level burning that needs to happen because they're traumatized. But I like to say, either you're going to get the smoke in the late summer from a wildfire, or you're going to get it in smaller amounts during the winter as we do our pile burns and prescribed burns. So take your pick. You're going to get smoke. Hopefully a lot less if we do it in a more controlled way. But you can't just say don't burn anything. These are fire adapted forests. They need to burn. They're going to burn. You can't. But to make biochar in the woods from a burn pile is not that hard. It's just you have to change your mindset a little bit. And all it requires really is getting some water there. So we're working on several different projects now and with a lot of different people. We have a network called the Biochar in the Woods Network that's hosted by the U.S. Biochar Initiative. And I think the link is in my email signature you can find to share that if people want to join us. So we're talking with forestry contractors, we're talking with landowners, all kinds of people who are interested in helping develop these techniques. And as a network, we've learned a lot over the last few years. Basically, you just need to get water there and put that pile out before it burns to ash. And you get a couple of really good advantages from that. Not only do you make the biochar, you, of course, put less carbon in the atmosphere because anything that stays as char is not carbon that goes in the atmosphere. The way we like to burn these piles is quick, hot burns. So keeping that flame always on top of the pile, the way we light it, it burns most of the smoke. So very little smoke. And then maybe one of the biggest advantages is when you let a burn pile burn all the way to ash, that charcoal burns hot. Think about a charcoal grill. When you grill your meat, that is hot, radiant heat. And when that's sitting right in contact with the ground, you burn up the organic layer there, the top organic layer. And so you look under those burn piles and it's just rocks, bare dirt. And they can take years and years to regenerate before you get enough litter falling from the forest to create another organic layer. So you've just punched little holes. If you've got 50 piles an acre, you've punched 50 holes in the forest floor where you're not going to get much of anything growing for years. And then the first things that do come in, they can grow there are going to be invasive species. You can get thistles and knapweed and all this stuff. So there's a lot of advantages to changing the way we do burn piles. When you have the water there to put it out, that ought to also make people feel a little safer because you've got water there when they're done by professionals. But having the water there just should make people feel a little better. So this is a very simple change that we're advocating for right now, and really hope that people will start adopting it. Land managers, and large forest owners, but also anybody who lives in the West, farmers who do little burn piles. If you have any kind of acreage at all, you're doing burn piles, and just put them out with water at the end.
That's such a critical point. And I think it's funny. There are often in almost every situation, there are these very simple strategies that people just think, how could that possibly make that much of a difference? But it really makes all the difference in the world. It's the difference between something that, is kind of a gift that keeps on giving. And like you say, leaving a hole behind that then has to be filled. It's another deficit. So I think that's a great point. And I really appreciate that you brought that up. And I think now it would be really cool to talk about what biochar does for the soil, especially for, our audience who are largely growing food for, food crops and vegetables and things like that, and how all the promises that biochar kind of, I think it's become, like I said, it's become quite a hot ticket item, but I think it would be great to just kind of talk about it because I've had very different experiences with biochar, just depending on how I've used it. And so I think it would be really interesting to get into like the observations that you've made on field soils, and then also, in the forest, and just all the solutions that biochar can sort of provide.
Well, that's a big topic. Tell me though, first, what your experience has been.
I remember vividly, like the first time that I ever spoke with you was I was calling because I had read about Terra Preta after a conference that I went to, and I was like, oh, I want to get my hands on some biochar. And so I called a bunch of people, and I was eventually put in your direction, and you were very kind to speak with me. And there was a neighbor of mine who was doing some clearing, and they really wanted to have a sort of a more beneficial outcome for that waste material than just leaving it out there to either oxidize or just doing piles. And so they had a kiln, a mobile kiln, come and make some biochar for them. And we bought quite a bit of it, and I wanted to do some field trials. And so we did everything from composting it with our animal manure, to feeding it through our pigs, to just field dressing it, applying it directly to the soil. I'm a no-till operation, so we weren't doing any integration into the soil. And so we had really different outcomes based on how we used it. And it was all really interesting, because the one thing I can say across the board, no matter how we applied it, there was an immediate water holding capacity shift. So we would, kind of put these things right next to each other. And in terms of like just the water holding capacity of the soil in that first year, we saw increases across the board. But what we didn't anticipate, and I remember you warning me about this, was that where we just field dressed it sort of straight up, no treatment whatsoever, we did see some tie up of especially nitrogen in that first year. And so our crops looked a little anemic in that first season of using just the naked biochar. But where we had composted it, or even, probably the most interesting thing was where we, kind of fed it through pigs, was very fascinating in terms of the fertility. And where I really noticed it most was in the health of our floor. So we just saw, kind of a healthier stand, a more diverse stand of what was a natural cover crop for us. I mean, this was just sort of a natural vineyard floor. And we saw the germination of wildflowers that had been in the seed bed that hadn't bloomed, and I don't even know how long they had been sitting there. So it was really interesting just to have used it in all those different ways. And I think for people who haven't used it before, it would be great for you to talk about how some of that works and why it is related to the structure of carbon in biochar.
Okay, well, those are all really interesting experiences you've had, and that goes to two properties of biochar. It's porosity, so there's a lot of holes in it, and related to that is surface area. And they say that a good biochar can have as much surface area in a teaspoon as the surface area of a football field, which is pretty difficult to wrap your mind around, right? But you think about all these tiny pores at different scales, and each pore is surrounded by a surface. And so that surface area is really key. And then the other thing that's key is the aromatic carbon structure and the way those carbon atoms are bonded. There's a lot of the electrons that are free to move around throughout that whole scaffolding. That whole carbon scaffolding has electrons that can move and can bind to things. So that makes it kind of like an electrostatic attraction where it can hold on to various nutrients. And then once microbes move in, and they like those surfaces because they can live on those surfaces. And when microbes move into biochar and live on the surfaces, they can use the nutrients that are bound there. They can use the water that's bound there. And then there's oxygen as well in those pores. And when they start moving in there and you get different microbes and they start working together, and so called direct interspecies electron transfer, where during their metabolic processes, sometimes they need to dump an electron to complete a reaction, and sometimes they need one. So it lets them cooperate and live together in a more functional ecosystem. And you see this in some of the research studies that look at respiration from soils with biochar. versus not biochar. And you find that there's more microbe diversity. The microbes are working together better. So there's less CO2 being emitted from those soils. Even though there's more life in them, there's less CO2 because they're metabolically more efficient as a community. So that's really fascinating. And that's really part of how biochar really works so effectively, biologically. And then, of course, there's the physical and chemical parameters as well, with the physical structure of it, the surface area and the pores, and then the chemical, electrical components of it. So yeah, it's very complicated, of course, and I don't pretend to understand it in every dimension. I just know that it works. And you can really see this. You can measure this a lot if you use biochar and compost, and you do compost piles side by side with and without biochar, and you just measure the temperature, and you can see the compost with biochar heats up quicker and finishes quicker and makes a better compost. I've had some of my compost tested, and it's more biologically diverse. It's got more nutrients, and it's a better compost.
In your experience, and I know you do workshops with farmers and you do workshops in the forest, do you feel like the way that it gets applied really has a significant impact on the outcome? Because I definitely feel like being no-till, the benefits, I think, maybe took a little bit longer. Is that your experience? I mean, the incorporation, I think, getting beyond the sort of roots of the turf level, that was probably one of the ways that we could have mitigated the delay, the latency of some of the effects that we saw. It just took longer. Is that your experience as well?
Well, most of my experience is in my own garden, my vegetable garden. And I run all my biochar through compost first, and then I just apply it as I apply compost. So I think that's really the easiest way to use biochar. Of course, there's so many different agricultural systems. In a conventional system, there's lots of different ways to use it, combined with fertilizer. For instance, in China, there are fertilizer plants that are making an NPK fertilizer combined with biochar. And that's probably a really great idea for conventional ag, because you're going to solve a lot of problems with application that way, and you're going to get the benefits of the biochar holding onto the nutrients right away. And that's a really good pathway for conventional ag. You can also apply it at seeding with other fertilizer mixes. There's farmers in the U.S. who are doing that. But for people who are trying to do regenerative ag and no-till, just putting it in the compost like you've been doing. So, how do you get benefit from compost with no-till? I mean, there are some farmers I know of who have done deep ripping, chisel plowing. I'm not really sure exactly what different methods they use to get it in deep in the soil. It's kind of a one-time application. I think there's a vineyard in California that's done that in a very sandy soil. So if you have this very sandy soil that has really a lot of trouble holding on to water, that's probably worth doing. And doing it at vineyard establishment would be the best, right? Putting it down deep in the soil profile, starting your starts with it, in your propagation, putting it in from the beginning. I do that in my gardening is, I have it in my potting soil to start with. So it's the roots are getting right in there immediately. So there's, where in your production process can you add biochar? What's the soonest place you can add it is what I would look at. In a vineyard that's already established and you're not going to do the deep ripping, I'm not really sure the best way, although, putting it in your cover crop on your floor, like you said, that would kind of get it into the roots more quickly, because your vine roots are deeper, right? But if you have it in with your cover crop, so it's in the roots of the cover crop more quickly, then that could have some benefits, because the roots of the cover crop may share nutrients and signaling and so forth with the vine roots.
But I think it's still worth doing. I mean, I definitely want to just reinforce the fact that across the board, we saw better water holding capacity. And in the West, especially in the last 10, 15 years, that has become super critical, not just for, vineyards and orchard systems, but even for, I work with different farming operations, and having greener pasture longer, makes a huge difference in how many numbers of days you get on a pasture with your animals, or whether, like you said, I mean, we've done, since that initial foray into biochar, I've experimented with putting plugs in. I've experimented with doing, like you said, in the establishment process, digging very deep holes and putting some of the biochar compost into the bottom of the holes before your plants go in. And I think it makes a huge difference in that first opportunity that you have to sort of set things up properly. So I just encourage people to experiment with it. And along those lines, what advice do you have for people? I mean, do you think that, if there are market gardeners listening who are, doing a lot of annual crops, would you advise them to try to seek out like a biomass plant, or would you recommend they check out like your Ring of Fire kind of home style kiln, or does it really just depend on whether or not they think they have the feedstock for it?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the individual situation. If you're already disposing of that material, then by all means, try a different way. Get a kiln. You can make quite a bit of biochar in a kiln. No farmers who are making 10, 20 cubic yards a year just from burn piles and then putting it in compost. It's not going to be that much extra work for you. On the other hand, one of the producers I worked with was a small goat dairy, and they were using we made biochar from their woody debris, and they were using it in the goat. They ran out of time. They just had too much to do. And so they lived close enough. They could go over to the power plant and buy the biochar. And that worked out for them. I think we figured out it was costing them $6 a week to add biochar to the barn. So it wasn't that big of an expense. And then they didn't have to do the labor of making the biochar. So it really depends on the individual situation. If people are looking to buy biochar, the U.S. Biochar Initiative has a directory of where, people that sell biochar. So check that out. There's quite a number of distributors around the West Coast where you can go pick it up. The problem is always the transportation. And so if you can find a place that distributes it where you can go and buy a cubic yard sack, that's going to be the most economical way to get it.
Definitely. And I do love that website for just finding local sources of things like that, because it is something that I think people will be curious about. I also just want to say that I think for vineyards, for orchards where we prune every winter, and some people either flail those prunings in the field like we often do in viticulture, or people do burn their pruning wood in filberts and apples because of potential disease vectors. And I think that biochar kilns for those operations might be really, really smart, just to kind of help retain some of that carbon in the system and deal with some of those diseases and transmission without having to, dispose of it some other less efficient way. I know that I've taken up a lot of your time, but I wanted to end on kind of what you think your next thing is going to be. I mean, where are you going to take biochar next? Your book is amazing. And I think that for anyone, I mean, whether you're a backyard gardener or a professional grower of some kind, that handbook is so helpful and so practical in terms of the benefits of biochar, how you can make it, how you can source it, all of those things. And so for you, where do you hope to take this next? Like, what's your hope for the future?
Well, thanks for asking that. I'm going to be teaching a course this winter, January through March. It's a 9-week course, one session a week through regenerative living. It's going to be called Practical Biochar. And the Biochar Handbook will be the textbook. And I will go through, bunch of the chapters, really, just talking about my really practical techniques for making and using biochar. Give you some ideas about how to design your own kiln. I'm really a big advocate of doing it yourself. And that's really an avenue that's open to a lot of people. And it'll really be for not just farmers, but also gardeners and even people who don't really even have a garden yet, but just want to learn about this technique and start dreaming and thinking about how to implement it. I've been thinking about where I'm going with biochar, and I've been thinking about how to categorize the different aspects of biochar because there are so many. We haven't talked at all about using biochar in materials, as a component of cement and all these things. We're using biochar for remediation of contaminated soils, bigger picture things like that. And so I'm trying to sort it out in my mind, and I've come up with 3 main categories. So the first category is what I call subsistence biochar. So this is biochar that just helps people become more resilient who are either, smallholders, farmers, or gardeners, homesteaders, people in developing countries that have no money for inputs. They can make biochar and use their own urine as a fertilizer. And there are some examples of people in Africa doing that where it's making a huge difference in their lives. They're being able to grow a lot more food. So to me, that is really, I think, the most important part of biochar is how it can improve our own resilience, our regenerative practices, and help us become more self-reliant and less dependent on big industrial processes and fossil fuel energy and all of that. So the biochar is really where I'm one area where I'm working and practicing for myself. It has increased my own food security tremendously. Not that I'm food insecure. I live in the United States. There's lots of food, but the quality of our food's not so great. So I'm able to grow just mountains of produce. Right now, I'm just drowning in it, this time of year, right? So I spent all day yesterday canning and cooking and anyway, and not complaining. But so increasing food security is super important to me. So that's subsistence biochar. And then the next category of biochar I would call stewardship biochar. That's what I'm doing with the forestry work. And, looking at the bigger picture of our planet and how we're going to survive on this planet in the face of not just climate change, but land degradation, loss of ecosystems and ecosystem functions, water, biodiversity. Biochar can restore degraded land, and there's in a lot of ways returning carbon to soil. Our soils are so carbon depleted. I often look at this problem not just as the climate problem, not just as, well, there's too much carbon in the atmosphere, right? And that's heating, causing the planet to heat. That's not the only problem, and it's not the only way to look at it. The other way to look at it is there's not enough carbon. So if you look at it that way, then the atmosphere is a mine that we can mine that carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in soil. And it's just a much better way to look at the problem. If you look at it as a pollution problem, then people are going to come up with all kinds of crazy, dumb things like, pumping CO2 gas
Vacuums
underground. No, that's like, there's no benefits to that. But using it to build soil carbon, yes. So, so that's stewardship biochar. And especially where we're making it char in place and just leaving it there, it's for the ecosystem, just to give back. That's stewardship biochar. And then the last category is commercial biochar. And that's everything that most people think of when they think of biochar. So that's, finding investors, building a plant, making the char, finding a market, selling it for whatever use, whether it's agriculture, whether it's, for environmental remediation, or for products, cement, things like that. And that's all really tough. And there's a lot of work to do there. But I'm really working primarily on the other two lower tech ends of things. Although, I certainly have things to say about industrial biochar as well.
I don't doubt it. And I hope we'll have more conversations in the future. And I so appreciate you coming on today and sharing some of your knowledge with us. Again, I highly recommend your book, the Biochar Handbook. And even like I went back and read some articles that I could find online that you had written from, back in the day when you were writing for publications. And so I think you have a very thoughtful and very practical approach. And clearly you have followed your passion and integrity to arrive where you are, and you've earned every bit of accolade. So thank you, Kelpie, for sharing your time with us today. And we will all be checking out all of your links in the show notes, and wishing you the best. And also we'll point people to your website so they can look at your workshops and the course that you're going to be teaching.
Great. Thank you so much, Mimi. It's great to finally meet you. I know we talked in the past, and it's the first time I've actually been able to see each other. So, hopefully we'll talk again.
All right. Thanks, Kelpie. Have a great day. I really enjoy being able to take something that we talk about in such a negative way, like carbon, as it shows up in our atmosphere and is currently causing some problems, and turn it into a possible solution. We've all explored these topics deeply, I think, in our minds. And now maybe it's time to go out and play a little, practice, get a little biochar. If you get a hold of Kelpie's book, you will see that this can be done on a very small scale in your own backyard for your own operation, especially if you are regularly dealing with any kind of biomass waste. And I encourage everyone to just get in and start playing with this stuff, because it's fascinating to do experiments with. It's really, really cool to see what it does over time. And I think that it has so many more applications than we even have explored on this podcast, but even just yet in the world, because it's an expanding field. Go out, adventure, explore, fire back what you learn. We're excited to hear about what you think about biochar, and we'll see you soon.
All right, we hope you enjoyed that episode. Always make sure to check the links in the show notes for how to follow our guests and hosts. The No-Till Market Garden podcast is a free show that is supported by folks like you who contribute every month over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. That support helps ensure all the shows we do, from the Seed Farmer podcast to the Winter Growers podcast, the Collaborative Farming podcast, the Composter podcast, Growers Daily, and of course the No-Till Market Garden podcast, can continue to go and grow. You can also find books and hats, as well as an active forum over at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge thank you to editor Michael Sellis and producer Jackson Roulette for all their work on this show and the rest of the team over at no-tillgrowers.com. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and make sure you are subscribed wherever you're hearing this so you don't miss the next episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. See you then.
Have you been to the Great Wolf Lodge that's nearby? We took our kids last weekend and they won't stop talking about it. There's a huge indoor water park that's always 84 degrees, and they have dozens of other family activities like a ropes course, bowling, and more. It's the perfect getaway. It's so close, we literally hopped in the car and we were there in no time. We all had a blast and we barely had to do any planning. So if you have a free weekend coming up, now's the time to book a trip to the Perryville Lodge just outside of Baltimore. Or if you're in the Virginia area, check out the Lodge in Williamsburg. Head to greatwolf.com to book your stay today.